So we're here for the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Show of hands, how many people here are over 50 years old? Okay, me too. I'm actually 62, so you may have experiences like mine as well. I remember being about 10 years old and I went to a Jewish day school. It's like a parochial school, but we call them day schools in New York City, and we did not have fields to play in like they do here in Westchester County. We used to play ball on our roof, but there was a Catholic parochial school around the corner. And I guess they must have had better relations with the police department than we did, because the police actually closed off the street in front of their school, and they played outside. And we always used to go by all the time and say, that's really terrific. So one day, a group of us went over to the kids in that school and said, can we play with you? And they said very nicely, not with any hostility at all, no, you killed our God, we can't play with you. So I remember talking to my grandmother about that experience, who had lived through pogroms and lived through the Holocaust, and she said, nothing's going to change. This is what people are taught together with their mother's milk. But then something has changed, and that is Nostra Aetate. So now, 50 years later, we've got this guy over here who takes people to Israel so that they can meet with Christian groups there and help the Christian groups. We've got this lady over here who takes people to Auschwitz, her students to Auschwitz, the death camps of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, to teach them what they are. And in case there's any confusion, this guy is the Jew and she's the Catholic. So tell us, what is Nostra Aetate, and can you briefly describe the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate?
Thank you, Cliff, for the introductions and a really poignant story. It really is, and poignant more so because it's been reproduced so many times. So we want to begin with what's the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, especially for the students here who are here tonight. 50 years ago, on October 11th, 1962, so we just, yes, it's the 15th, so just 4 days ago, 50 years ago, all the world's Catholic bishops gathered in Rome for 4 years, well, every fall for 4 years. Longest running meeting in history, on record. And they gathered together to address the modern world. In Jewish terms, it was like the Catholic Haskalah, excuse my pronunciation. They confronted the modern world. In the words of a document that is to have its anniversary in December, the Church's Constitution on the Church in the modern world, it said, the joys and hopes, the griefs and sorrows of the people of this world are the joys and hopes, the griefs and sorrows of the followers of Christ. And roughly paraphrasing the next 30 pages or so, and we want to engage with you. We want to engage with the world. And Pope John the 23rd, I knew I was going to forget to turn, right? There's Pope John the 23rd, the good Pope, and the Second Vatican Council in session. He said, we need to throw open the windows, throw open the doors, and let the fresh breezes come through. I want to quote his opening speech. John said, in the daily exercise of our pastoral office, we sometimes have to listen, much to our regret, to voices of persons who, though burning with zeal, are not endowed with too much sense of discretion or measure. In these modern times, they can see nothing but prevarication and ruin. And he continues, we feel we must disagree with these prophets of gloom, who are always forecasting disaster as though the end of the world were at hand. John the 23rd was a historian, and he understood, I think I just hit something, excuse me. He understood history and the progress of history, and he convened the world's councils in an ecumenical council. It means worldwide, all these bishops, in order to say, how do we engage with the world? We can learn from the world, and we have a message, in Pope Francis's terms, the joy of the gospel, to share with the world. And he said the substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing, and the way in which it is expressed is another. So he wanted to update. His favorite word was aggiornamento, the updating of the church. And that led us to 16 documents, one of which is Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Church's relationship to non-Christian religions, and Noam is going to address that.
So Nostra Aetate is not necessarily the most significant document for the Catholic Church that emanated from the Second Vatican Council, but it is the most important for the Jewish people in its relationship with the Catholic Church. And it was a liberating document both for Catholics and for Jews. Because after 2 millennia of Christian, Catholic, anti-Jewish sentiment based on a theology of rejection of the legitimacy of Jewish expression continuing in the Christian era, the Catholic Church engaged in a period of self-reflection about the violence that emanated from those hateful traditions. And in the years after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, realized what role the Catholic Church had played in violence that was directed at Jews. And Pope John XXIII, who had saved thousands of Jews during the Shoah as a papal nuncio, an ambassador in different cities, and as a result of his education, which we'll speak about a little bit more, he realized that we needed a new direction. And he commissioned Augustine Bea to help navigate the process by which an outreach to the Jewish people would be completed. We will drill deeper into Nostra Aetate in a little while. But it was a beginning of a process that continues until this day. Nostra Aetate was a good document. It was not a perfect document. There were those who even were disappointed when it came out because they felt that it didn't go far enough. But today, when we look back 50 years and we see the entire structure of Catholic-Jewish relations, of notes, of guidelines, of educational materials, of relationships like the ones that we're celebrating here today, we know that the foundation that Nostra Aetate built bore fruit. Tonight's gathering would be inconceivable 50 years ago. Today, it's just what Catholics and Jews and people of goodwill do. So the Catholic Church was able, as I like to say, to turn the aircraft carrier around. And it was as hard as turning an aircraft carrier around. They had to dig deep, reflect fully, and then produce a document that enabled so many bishops to support it nearly unanimously, and for the Jewish people to feel that they had been heard, that they were reached out to, and that they could respond in a parallel fashion.
So there have been 2,000 years of history between Jewish people and Catholic people, and many documents and sermons and publications and books have been written by Catholics about Jews and Judaism. What's different about Nostra Aetate in the sense that what weight does it have that's different from anything else that preceded it?
In terms of Catholic theology and the authority of various statements, the importance of this document is that it comes from an ecumenical council. As I said before, meaning ecumenical, meaning universal meeting of the world's bishops. So in terms of stating what's authoritative in the Roman Catholic Church, statements from the Pope like encyclical letters or apostolic exhortations or constitutions are the top level statements of popes. However, the Pope is really a bishop. He's the Bishop of Rome. He's first among the bishops as one of his titles. But he's a bishop, and at an ecumenical council, there are only 21 of them in 2,000 years, he's one of the bishops. And so all the bishops, the teachers, the pastors, right, teaching together is of the highest authority in the church. There are some technicalities about the 3 different types of documents at the council. I don't want to confuse matters by going into that. But those 16 documents have the universal acceptance of the world's bishops, and that makes them of highest authority. All of the other things were written about Jews and Judaism prior to that in Christian history were what I would call occasional statements. A sermon, a reflection, a hysterical screed like Martin Luther's The Jews and Their Lies. But they were individuals writing or preaching. Now, they had a horrible effect because it was constantly repeated, but it wasn't with the authority of doctrine. And so the council gives us, this is the belief of the Roman Catholic Church.
Nostra Aetate is different because it was not left as a document to gather dust on a shelf. And in addition to the structures that were built, there were papal gestures that made all the difference in the world. We have the long tenure of John Paul II, 27 years. I believe the second longest tenure in the papacy. And he, with his symbolic gestures, was able to communicate Nostra Aetate in profound ways. The first pope, as Catholics like to say since Peter, to visit a synagogue. A pope who went on pilgrimages to the sites of the Holocaust, and there, on bended knee, expressed the contrition of the church and Christianity for its role in the Shoah. The Pope who recognized Israel and established diplomatic relations with the Jewish people in the 1990s, and then at the turn of the millennium, traveled to the state of Israel, and if a picture is worth 1,000 words, went over to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, and put his message of apology into the crevices. That's worth thousands of documents, that picture. And then Pope Benedict XVI, who emulated Pope John Paul II, indicating that this is what popes do. They go to synagogues. They go to Israel. They reach out and visit Holocaust sites. And now we have Pope Francis, already the 3rd pope in a row to go in this path. He's the first post-Nostra Aetate pope. What does that mean? He was ordained after Nostra Aetate, and he was able to implement it in real time with his fellow Jews, or Catholics with Jews, in Argentina, in the 7th largest Jewish community in the world. Priest, bishop, cardinal, doing programs like this, visiting synagogues, establishing Holocaust memorials, developing a very public relationship with Rabbi Abraham Skorka, his friend, and publishing only one book before he was a pope, co-authored with a rabbi, Tell that to your grandparents and see if they'll believe you. It's emblematic of the revolution. And I'll conclude this part by sharing with you the prayer that Pope John Paul II wrote and placed in the kotel. God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours to suffer. And asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant. These are game changers in Catholic-Jewish relations.
And to his prayer, I will say Amen. So give me a sense, how many people here would not consider themselves very familiar with the Christian Bible, with the New Testament? Okay, so maybe it would be helpful to have some guidance. Can you give us some background about what Christian teaching is about Jews and Judaism, perhaps what the New Testament, what the Christian Bible says about Jews and Judaism?
Well, we first want to remember that many of the authors of the Christian Bible, the second half, let me say the second half of the Christian Bible, were Jews themselves, right? There's still a lot of confusion and research. One of my teachers in graduate school said, if you think you know anything about the New Testament, who wrote them, where they were written, what they mean, you don't know anything. But we do want to understand that Jewish context, and that will come up later in terms of drilling down on Nostra Aetate, as we said before. But there are statements that get repeated. Christians hear them a lot during Holy Week, such as the Jews said, in undifferentiated the Jews, as if it were all Jews everywhere. The Jews said, crucify him, crucify him. We hear this throughout Good Friday liturgy. And so it is in the text, and Cliff and I had been having discussions about what does that mean, that certain Christian reactions or learned behaviors over time are not just sort of an irrational sort of reaction, but because it's embedded in the teaching. I think I want to leave it there because I'm conscious of time, and I didn't know if you wanted Noam to continue or we could move into some of the other.
I would just say about the New Testament, about Christian scriptures, that they are much like ancient documents in all religions. They are written at a certain moment in time, and they were interpreted by commentators in a particular way, and very often that was not in a philo-Jewish, a philo-Semitic way. And what we have done, all religions that progress and reform themselves, we begin to apply scholarship to contextualize ancient texts and to focus on those texts that lift up the bright light and push down the evil darkness so that religions progress. And that's part of the process that has emanated from Nostra Aetate in reevaluating Christian scripture.
Okay. So for us to understand how Nostra Aetate changed things, could you go over what it was like before Nostra Aetate, anytime you want to pick over the 2,000 years of history, for communities, sort of for the everyday life of Catholic people and Jewish people. Once Christianity became a state religion and the church and the state were unified, what was it like for people living in that time, in those conditions?
Okay, so basically I think you're asking what happened to all of these occasional teachings. It doesn't mean that they didn't happen frequently, right? People went to church, they heard sermons, people were writing. So this repetition that drew from some anti-Jewish statements that are embedded in the New Testament. What happened in terms of life between Jews and Christians? So scholars have summarized all of this teaching into 5 concepts. So we want to just go over these 5 concepts to give the contrast to the revolution started with Nostra Aetate. So behind, up on the screen you see Jules Isaac, and I often teach him as the tutor to the Pope. So he lost his family in the Shoah, and he became the French Minister of Education, Social Studies education, after the war. And because his life was so tragically changed, his own research was the roots of anti-Semitism in history. And he coined the phrase, the teaching of contempt. And so we're going to categorize all the negative anti-Jewish teachings by Christians against Jews under this umbrella phrase of the teaching of contempt. And we're going to go through 5 concepts to summarize it really quickly. First of all, diaspora or dispersion. So that the teaching that people heard, what they learned, what they understood in subtle and not so subtle ways over time through preaching and teaching was that Jews were dispersed from the land. And so we see in the top slide picture the burning of Jerusalem in the year 70, when the Romans sacked Jerusalem. And there's a reason, which we'll come to, for this calamity that befalls the Jews. So because of actions of the Jews, these punishments, according to church teaching, are just what are to be expected. Noam, did you want to say a word on the Arch of Titus and that image?
Yeah, some of you may recognize the Arch of Titus that's in Rome, in Christian Rome, and it shows the Jewish people carrying the temple ritual objects after the sack of the temple in Jerusalem at the hands of Rome in the year 68 to 70 of this era. And that is relevant because part of the anti-Jewish narrative, a key piece was that the Jews were punished for not accepting Jesus as Messiah with the destruction of the temple. That was part of what was taught, I believe, by Church Father Origen. Am I correct?
In fact, Origen said, Origen lives in the 2nd century, it behooved that city where Jesus underwent these sufferings to perish utterly and the Jewish nation to be overthrown. So not a very happy history of teaching there. The next idea is that the Jews, for these same reasons of not recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, are dismissed from Revelation. The teaching is, you had the prediction in your own text in the Tanakh, yet you did not recognize the Messiah, therefore you're dismissed from Revelation. This picture, of course, a lot of the teaching in a pre-literate society, all of the teaching is through image. Or I shouldn't say pre-literate society, but of course in the Middle Ages only the very elite knew how to read, and so they taught through images to those who could not read, and this is a picture of burning of the Talmuds. Your revelation, the Christian church is saying to Judaism, is over, it's gone, now we have it. So this notion of being dismissed from Revelation, and a Roman Catholic cardinal, Faulhaber of Munich, in 1934 said, after the death of Christ, Israel was dismissed from the service of Revelation. And so for nearly 2,000 years, we had this teaching, a very pernicious teaching. And what does it all come down to? The deicide, or the Christ killer charge. And this is inscribed, as Cliff was saying, in the Gospel. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 25, famously known or infamously known as the blood curse. And the whole people said in reply, "His blood be on us and our children." And in 1 Thessalonians in the New Testament, the Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets. And we multiply these and can multiply these, and I don't like to because it's painful. This image is from a Nazi children's book, The Poison Mushroom. And you probably cannot see the inscription on the bottom, but the text is, "When you see a cross, remember the gruesome murder by the Jews on Golgotha." Now, the Nazis, excuse me, were no fans of Christians in the end either, but they took the Christian teaching to help further their own cause. So it's a particularly unnerving image of the deicide teaching. All of this builds up into the notion of Christians thinking that the Jewish religion is degenerate, built on things like the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark, saying things like, "Alas for you, you Pharisees and hypocrites," or "This people, the Jews, pays me lip service, but their heart is far from me." So extracting biblical verses, not understanding them in context, as Rabbi Marans said, historical criticism in the 19th and 20th century helps us locate these verses differently. But you extract them, you take them out of context, and you begin to talk about this rich Jewish religion as a dead religion, as a degenerate religion. And the most famous of these images, perhaps, are these statues that are found on the carved into the Cathedral of Strasbourg, France. And they're ecclesia and synagoga. And ecclesia has got her cross on a staff and holding that cup and looking very regal, and looking down her nose, if you look there, at synagoga, the way these images are placed next to each other. And synagoga, the Jewish people, the clothes are more tattered, the book is broken in the left hand, the staff in the right hand is broken. And this is another visual image. So Christians would see this time and time again. So these conversations that you and I have had about, it's not just an irrational thing, it's consciously and subconsciously reinforced by these images. The church, ecclesia, is royal and in charge, and the synagogue is broken and passed, superseded, as we say. Sorry. And the last D, as we say, of the 5 Ds, is this horrible accusations of the Jewish people as demonic. So students in the room who aren't Jewish but are Christian, you probably don't know this, and we call it the shadow on the cross in Christian history, because this is a terrible history to say that the Jews killed Christ, the Jews killed God. Well, it was the Romans who killed Jesus of Nazareth. Crucifixion is a Roman capital punishment, and only they could do it. But from that came all of these other things. So you killed God, so you are of the devil. In the Gospel of John, you are sons of the devil. So again, these things that are in there that we have to preach about differently now. The black and white photograph is horrible. It's a cauldron, and the cauldron says Jews. And you can see a Jewish person being tossed in, and on the other side is the devil. And then the color photograph is of a painting, an Italian painting depicting the blood libel, that awful canard that Jewish people murdered Christian babies, stole them and murdered them to create Passover food, this unbelievable myth in the bad sense. And so this is the type of teaching that grew up. But we don't have that anymore.
So how did Nostra Aetate respond to this?
So Nostra Aetate can be analyzed in many different ways. It's a remarkably brief document. It's only a couple of thousand words. And the famous fourth paragraph, you have it on your table, addresses the Jews, about 600 words. And it's rare that 600 words can have the kind of revolutionary impact that it has had on society, because it's not just about Catholic-Jewish relations, it's about wider Christian-Jewish relations in which each of the denominations beyond Catholicism use this as the gold standard by which they would address their own evolution within their denominations. And I have identified 5 pillars of Nostra Aetate's fourth paragraph, which would be good if we could assimilate them as part of our Jewish and Catholic knowledge and transmit them to others during this 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate.
Let me just interrupt 1 second. On your tables, you have the entirety of Nostra Aetate. And so that's in 5 sections. And what you want to be looking at, potentially, while Rabbi Marans speaks, is Nostra Aetate number 4. This is the section of the teaching on Jews and Judaism.
In many ways, the most significant revolution of the post-Nostra Aetate era is the teaching that Jesus and his followers were Jewish. Now, you would think that that would not be big news, right? Who could think that Jesus is anything other than Jewish? But the truth is that for most of Christian teaching, he had been presented as the first Christian, and these were Christian followers. A ridiculously anachronistic assertion, because they were Jews who were working out what Judaism means, and they were breaking from the rabbinic traditions in their ways. I cannot tell you how important it is in the transformation of lay Catholic thinking that their priests and bishops and cardinals and popes and teachers have said to them time and time again, Jesus was a Jew. If you want to understand Jesus, you need to understand Judaism. The first family was a Jewish family. And no longer can you relate to it as a Christian family, because that's just ignorant and got us into this mess in the first place. Number 2, that God's covenant with the Jewish people is eternal, based on Romans 9 through 11. God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. And subsequent popes refer in a variety of different ways about the eternal covenant of God with the Jewish people. Never rendered, never sundered, always eternal, kept forever. How there can be 2 living covenants at the same time, that's a separate lecture for Jewish and Christian theology that Catholics like to say is a mystery that will be resolved in the end of days. Jews shouldn't laugh too much, because that's what we do with every problem we have. If we don't resolve it, we'll say it'll be resolved in the end of days. Repudiation of the deicide charge. What happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. This is a rejection of the collective guilt charge against Jews then and Jews now. It doesn't mean that there weren't Jews involved in demonizing Jesus and cooperating with the crucifixion. It's probably quite likely that he was seen as a political threat, and there were Jewish leaders who were upset by it. but to put it at the collective guilt of the Jewish people that they need to carry for eternity, rejected here. And as a result of the lack of embrace of Jesus as Messiah, Jews were portrayed as accursed, wandering, suffering. In fact, permitted to live so they could be witness to what happens to those who do not embrace Jesus as Christ. They should suffer and people should see that. Teaching of Jews as accursed, rejected. And lastly, not the first time that the Catholic Church spoke about anti-Semitism, but never more dramatically, condemned anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred against the Jewish people. These were written down, and then they were lived by courageous Catholics and Jews who took this intangible paper and made it alive in regular interaction and teaching and living and growing.
And we look at these pictures, and they represent, in many ways, this teaching of Nostra Aetate. So we had 5 points of negative teaching, the teaching of contempt, and now we have 5 points that come from Nostra Aetate that we call the teaching of respect. And Rabbi Marans had mentioned Pope John Paul at the Kotel at the Western Wall, and we see that picture there, putting in the prayer. Could you hold up this is a photograph of the prayer that was put in the wall. John Paul and the chief rabbi of Rome embracing, and a new synagoga et ecclesia, a new relationship of the church to the Jewish people. So these 2 statues are about this high. They are in New York City in the apartment of Sister Mary Boyes, who is the Dean of Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University. She asked a member of her religious community to craft a new image, because all of those images that we saw that were so negative, we need new ones in the world for the 50th anniversary. Mary Boyes had her friend craft these, and so synagogue and ecclesia they can talk to each other, they can dialogue. They're separate statues, they're about that high, they're beautiful, they're both regal, royal, the Torah scroll, the gospel and the cross, all in conversation, all with respect for each other. And afterwards, much later when we're through after our table conversations, I have 2 groundbreaking books from her. Has God Only One Blessing? Judaism as a source of Christian self-understanding. What Rabbi Marans was saying, Christians have to understand Judaism to understand Christianity. And then Redeeming Our Sacred Story, the death of Jesus and relations between Jews and Christians, how she is reclaiming a symbol that is so precious to Christians and so terrifying to Jews. How can we bring that symbol back and be respectful of both religions? So again, this teaching in images is important.
So how did Nostra Aetate come about? What was the process like? Who were the players? What were the challenges, if any, they may have faced? How did it all happen?
In a Roman Catholic council, you would think it happened all with Catholics and Catholic bishops, but it did not. And so I'm going to have Rabbi Marans refer to the other side of the development of the doctrine and who helped us, and we have some more pictures for that as well.
Thank you. Well, it's a great source of pride at an event like this to share how relevant AJC, American Jewish Committee, was to the process. The institution was in a class by itself in being an enabler, a table setter for Nostra Aetate. Judy Banke, who worked at AJC and is one of the living lights who is still around to tell about what happened during the Second Vatican Council, had written a study in 1961 that ultimately was used as part of the background study of different types of texts and other materials, particularly the image of the Jew in Catholic teaching. And she was joined in this process by the immortal Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, my legendary predecessor, who was the public face of AJC during those years, and saw that this was an opportunity that did not allow for passivity on the part of the Jewish people. He is in the upper left-hand corner, and Judy Banky is in the lower right-hand corner between two other leaders of the Nostra Aetate movement, Gregory Baum and Father Stransky, who were there and participated. And in the upper right-hand corner, one of AJC's most cherished photographs, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum brought his teacher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, into the process. Rabbi Heschel, who understood what happened during the Shoah, believed that the Nostra Aetate process could be a life-saving one for the Jewish people. If, after all, Jews were killed scores, thousands, and ultimately millions as a result of anti-Jewish teaching, if we have an opportunity to reverse anti-Jewish teaching, we have an opportunity to save Jewish lives. And Rabbi Tannenbaum brought Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel into the process and introduced him to Cardinal Augustine Bea, and he visited him in 1961, and he ultimately wrote a very famous memorandum that was part of the public record and the procedures and the deliberations at Nostra Aetate in that upper right-hand corner in 1963. In the thick of the Second Vatican Council, you see Cardinal Augustine Bea and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel studying together, looking in a book. And those of you who know the AJC building, that's on the 7th floor conference room at 165 East 56th Street, 15 feet from my office. It's an exciting place to feel that kind of history and transformation. So those are some of the players. They are all proof that individuals can change history.
They are, and I was just emailing back and forth with Judy. At the age of 88, she is going strong and speaking at the 92nd Street Y this coming Tuesday in a very big Nostra Aetate program. On the Catholic side, we have, there's obviously John the 23rd, but the committee that worked on the documents called the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity. And Father Stransky in the other picture is, as an older man in his 90s now, he's the one on the far side here. And we are eagerly awaiting his memoirs of the Council and the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, which was the committee that wrote Nostra Aetate, and that's the writing committee there with the Pope. And I'm just going to say that much because I'm aware of the time, but it was a complex process.
How about a shout out for Sister Rose Thiering?
Yes, of course. Let me go backwards.
Go back. I overlooked her, but
yes.
Go ahead.
So Sister Rose, the
bottom left-hand corner.
Yes. She was something of a firebrand, and so she was doing her doctoral research in St. Louis, I believe, on those 5 Ds, to put it, she anti-Jewish teaching in Christian textbooks. It was a major, major textbook study. And that provided a lot of the research for Judy Banky's memoranda. And so there's a Sister Rose Thiering chair at Seton Hall. She did a tremendous amount of work. And one of the great things was that she said, the bishops were getting upset with her, some bishop out, whoever was in her area, and told her she had to stop writing and speaking on this. Okay, so this is before Nostra Aetate. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that. She kept pursuing it because she saw the importance and she saw the tragedy this relationship of what sometimes we call twins or twin branches out of the same root, Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. And she wanted to cleanse that anti-Judaism from the church and from church teaching. And if my memory serves, AJC helped her with...
AJC was supportive both financially
Yes.
and emotionally, and made sure that her material got wider distribution and became part of the record of Nostra Aetate. See, this is one of those wonderful things that I think we all can relate to. You know, history does not happen in one moment in time. There's not a pre-Nostra Aetate and a post-Nostra Aetate. There's a process that's going on for decades before Nostra Aetate, gets an unfortunate jump start because of the Shoah, and then is fast-tracked. But there were giants who were working on this for decades before, and that's important to note. They were the people who laid the foundation, those who were bringing this to the attention. Seton Hall University was publishing papers in the 1950s that ultimately became the important documents that led to Nostra Aetate.
You make a really good point about the history, and so I'm going to put us back into 1928. Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical letter at that time, and it prohibited Roman Catholics from participating in ecumenical discussion. That means in conversations and study with other Christian groups, Roman Catholics and Lutherans, Roman Catholics and Baptists. So forget dialogue with other religions, not really on the table at all. However, as you said, there were people doing these things anyhow, courageous pioneers. So that revelation moment, that aha moment, always has a process leading up, the pioneers. And so we're grateful for that.
As you can probably see, the three of us could be sitting here talking about Nostra Aetate for hours and days. But part of what we wanted to accomplish tonight is actually to further the goals of Nostra Aetate and to have Catholics and Jews dialogue with each other. Let's go for some questions and answers on perhaps anything you heard tonight about Nostra Aetate, or if there are any questions you want to ask Rabbi Marans or Professor Procario-Foley.
It just occurred to me while I was listening to this, and here we are, Catholics and Jews, wondering about Protestants and why they're not part of this also.
Nostra Aetate, to be very clear, as I said earlier, is in 5 parts. The 5th part was just quoted for us by a Protestant minister, and the first part's an introduction that talks about the big questions of that we share in human life. And part 2 is about Buddhism and Hinduism. It has a very lovely line about the church rejects nothing that is holy and true in these religions. And number 3 is about the Catholic Church's relationship with Islam. So Nostra Aetate, while it began because of the expressed desire of Pope John the 23rd, who, as Rabbi Marans said, saved thousands and thousands of Jewish lives during the Holocaust, it began as a statement on the Church's relationship to Jews and Judaism. It ended up in its final form as a statement about the Church's engagement with all religions. As I said, Vatican II wanted to have the Church engage the world. So there are, in fact, Protestants in the room. We chose tonight intentionally to focus on the Jewish-Christian relationship, Nostra Aetate number 4, though I must say we had some very, very long discussions about whether we should have a panel with Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims. And I have, in my program here at Iona College, have had trilateral dialogues, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the Abrahamic religions, in the past. We wanted to focus specifically on the groundbreaking work of Nostra Aetate for the Jewish-Christian relationship. Other questions?
Any other questions?
Where are the young people?
Where are the young people? Probably at home doing their homework. We've got some professors here.
I will speak briefly. A few years ago, I had a program here in New Rochelle where we paired up Jewish 7th graders in their bar bat mitzvah classes with Catholic kids in their confirmation classes, and I worked with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and we had an interreligious study of the Holocaust. In Muhlenberg College out in Pennsylvania, every spring they have a major convocation of 100 or more middle and high school Jewish and Christian students that are brought to Muhlenberg College for interreligious engagement. So various centers of Jewish Christian dialogue across the universities and colleges have some programs for outreach to younger people. And then also colleagues like Rabbi Marans, myself, my academic colleagues in centers across the country, we go into churches and parishes, synagogues and parishes, and talk to them. Of course, I would love to have had more of my students, of our students at Iona College here, but they do come to the programs.
When Nostra Aetate came out, how was it accepted among the much broader Catholic community? Obviously, we heard from one table where what was being taught in school was different than what was being taught at home, and maybe it has to go through a couple generations. What was the feeling over the next 10, 20 years after Nostra Aetate first came out?
It's a good question. It's the question of what we call reception of church teaching. And on the panel I was just on Sunday at St. Joseph's, we talked about the deepening reception now. In the early decades, Nostra Aetate was one of 16 other documents. It has been called the most significant doctrinal shift in Catholic history. I teach my students about I remember I said ecumenical back in the 20s. The Catholics were told you couldn't do intra-Christian dialogue. And I tell them about my in-laws' family, my husband who's in the back, his father's side of the family, where he had aunts and uncles and who could not be married, they couldn't be married in the sanctuary of the church because it was a Lutheran Catholic marriage. They were, one's buried on one side of Danbury in the Lutheran cemetery and one's buried on the Catholic side. So I think people were ready for the intra-Christian dialogue and the interreligious dialogue. And it happens at 3 levels. I know this is a roundabout answer because there aren't direct answers to your question, I think, except that I think people were ready for it. But there's the official level of Roman Catholic Jewish dialogue, and that's a organization with a strange acronym, ICHKIC, right?
The International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations.
There you go. And so the bishops in this country have their official dialogue with the National Council of Synagogues. There's the academic dialogues that occur, and then there are the synagogue, parish, community level dialogues. And we need to continue to teach all of this, and we need to have the young people taught, and we need to have the parents who are home with their kids doing homework come so that they can help teach the students, the children. So it was very important. This document and the document on religious liberty, I heard some when I was much younger and just cutting my theological teeth. People told me those documents brought us back to the church. Once again, I thank you for coming to Iona College. Thank you for being here.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.